The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the old, half-abandoned industrial district. Martin Clay, once the proud owner of a lucrative import-export business, now found himself on the run. The gray-haired businessman, once respected in boardrooms across the city, had become the target of an ongoing corruption investigation. Martin's immaculate appearance had faded over the past few days. His expensive suit was crumpled, and a 5 o'clock shadow gave his face an uncharacteristic ruggedness. Beside him, not quite a friend but much more than an employee, stood Ivan. The hired security guard had worked for Martin for years, initially hired to keep thieves out of the company's warehouse and soon, quietly, also to handle Martin's less-than-legal dealings. Tall, imposing, with an expression hardened by years of fighting off trouble, Ivan was now caught up in Martin's frantic escape. He'd always been loyal to the money, until now when the job had become about survival. The two men stood inside a crumbling, long-forgotten building. From the second-floor window, Ivan surveyed the streets below, wary of the law enforcement vehicles that might come roaring around the corner at any moment. They had been evading capture for 3 days, crossing city lines and relying on cash and favors to stay hidden. "Why did you get me into this, Martin?" Ivan muttered, his voice a low growl. He turned to face the businessman, his eyes dark, reflecting both anger and a hint of disbelief. This was supposed to be just another job. Martin, sweat dripping down his brow, attempted a smile that came out more as a grimace. He adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit he'd developed since the first raid. "It got out of hand, Ivan. I didn't think they'd catch on so fast," he admitted. His voice held a tinge of desperation. The polished calm he once exuded in meetings now shattered. Ivan paced, his footsteps echoing through the empty room. The building around them was as broken as the partnership they now shared. Cracks running up the walls, a door hanging by one hinge. This wasn't where Ivan had imagined he'd end up when he accepted Martin's job offer 5 years ago. Back then, the pay was good and the risks were reasonable. He never asked questions. It wasn't in his nature. He was a doer, not a thinker. But now the line between employer and employee was blurred, and they were partners in crime, whether Ivan wanted to be or not. Suddenly, the distant wail of a siren cut through the silence. Martin's eyes widened, and he scrambled towards Ivan. "We need to move," he whispered, panic rising. "We can't stay here." Ivan hesitated. There was a part of him, just a small, stubborn part, that wondered if it might be easier to let Martin face the music alone. He owed him nothing more. The salary had ended with the first police raid. But then he saw the desperation in Martin's eyes, the realization that all his wealth and power meant nothing now. Ivan knew that if he abandoned Martin, he'd be next on the police's list. With a heavy sigh, Ivan nodded. "Fine. But no more screw-ups, Martin. We go straight to the safe house, we lie low, and you stay quiet." Martin swallowed hard and nodded, his face flushed with relief. He followed Ivan as they made their way down the crumbling staircase. Each step seemed to echo like a countdown to something inevitable. They exited through a side door, the air outside heavy with the scent of rust and exhaust. They were greeted by the sight of a deserted alleyway, stretching out like a narrow passageway to freedom. If only they could make it through. Ivan led the way, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. He had a plan, at least a semblance of one. They would get to the river, find the old boathouse where Ivan had hidden a car. From there, they'd try to get across state lines, disappear where no one knew Martin's name or cared about his past. But as they approached the alley's end, Ivan caught the gleam of something metallic. He pushed Martin roughly behind a stack of crates just as a police officer's flashlight cut through the dim light, the beam sweeping over where they had stood only seconds before. Ivan held his breath, Martin's panicked breathing unnaturally loud in the silence. The officer hesitated, the flashlight pausing just inches from their hiding spot. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The distant hum of the city, the echo of their breaths, the blinding light that threatened to expose them. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the light moved on. The officer, evidently unaware of their presence, continued his patrol down another street. Ivan exhaled slowly, releasing the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Martin, who looked close to tears. "Get it together," Ivan snapped, pulling him back to his feet. "We're not done yet." Martin nodded shakily, and they moved, inching towards their escape. The boathouse was only a few blocks away. Freedom seemed closer now, tangible almost, just at their fingertips. But for Ivan, the weight of his decision hung heavy, whether to truly help Martin get away or, at the right moment, let the businessman face what was coming to him. For now, they were two on the run, bound together by money, lies, and the relentless chase of a freedom that might never come. The boathouse was exactly as Ivan remembered. Old, abandoned, and half hidden by thick, creeping vines. It sat right along the riverbank, a forgotten relic of some long-past industrial age. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the murky scent of river water. Ivan pushed the creaky door open and ushered Martin inside. Dust floated in the narrow beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. "Where's the car?" Martin whispered, his voice shaky. "Back corner," Ivan replied, gesturing with a nod of his head. He moved toward the tarp-covered shape in the corner. Tugging it free, he revealed an old sedan. Its green paint faded, but the engine still sound enough for what they needed. Martin moved closer, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. "You think this'll get us far enough?" he asked. "It'll get us across the state line," Ivan replied curtly. He opened the driver's door, giving the interior a quick once-over before reaching beneath the seat for the keys he'd stashed earlier. The whole place was suffused with an eerie quiet, a sense of time standing still. Ivan didn't like it. He preferred movement, action, anything other than waiting in silence. Martin, meanwhile, seemed to collapse into himself, sinking onto an old crate by the wall. He ran a hand through his graying hair, a humorless smile playing at his lips. "You know, I had it all," he murmured, almost to himself. "The house, the business, the respect. I was untouchable." Ivan paused, leaning against the car. "Untouchable until you weren't," he said. There was no sympathy in his voice. "You got greedy, Martin. Greed is what brings men like you down." Martin's eyes flared with anger. "Men like me?" he shot back, voice trembling. "What about men like you, Ivan? You think you're any different? You took the money. You did the jobs." Ivan's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "I did my job," he said quietly. "I didn't make the choices. You did. I warned you when you started cutting corners, paying off the inspectors. But you didn't listen." Martin looked away, unable to meet Ivan's gaze. He seemed smaller now, diminished by his own mistakes and the weight of what he'd lost. After a moment, he whispered, "I thought I could handle it. I thought it would all just go away." "It doesn't work like that," Ivan replied, his voice cold. He pushed off from the car and crossed to Martin, grabbing his arm and pulling him up. "We need to go. The longer we stay, the worse our chances get." Martin stumbled to his feet, nodding. He knew Ivan was right. This wasn't a world where problems disappeared just because you wanted them to. And now, he was paying the price for thinking he could control everything, bend the world to his will. They piled into the car, Ivan behind the wheel, and the engine roared to life with a low growl. Ivan pulled the car out of the boathouse, maneuvering down the narrow dirt path that led to the road. The trees lining the path were dense, the afternoon light filtering through in a dappled pattern that danced across the car's hood. As they reached the main road, Ivan took a deep breath. It was a straight shot from here, at least until they hit the state line. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car surged forward, tires kicking up dust and gravel in their wake. For a while, there was silence between them, just the sound of the engine and the wind whipping through the open window. Martin stared out at the passing landscape, the familiar roads and buildings slowly giving way to more open fields and distant hills. For the first time, the reality of his situation seemed to truly sink in. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a fugitive, and there was no going back. "Where will we go?" Martin asked after a long while, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. Ivan kept his eyes on the road. "There's a guy I know near the border. He can get us papers, new IDs. After that, we split. You go your way, I go mine." Martin's face tightened at the thought of being on his own. He had always relied on people, connections, favors, influence. The idea of being truly alone, without anyone to bail him out, terrified him. "What if we stick together?" Martin suggested hesitantly. "We'd be safer in numbers." Ivan's laugh was short, harsh. "I don't think so, Martin. We're not partners. Once we're across the line, you're on your own. I'm not risking my life for you any longer." Martin opened his mouth to argue, but something in Ivan's expression made him stop. There was a finality there, a steely resolve that Martin knew he couldn't break. He turned back to the window, his fingers drumming anxiously on the armrest. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when they finally saw the sign. State border. 10 miles. Ivan's grip on the wheel tightened. He pushed the car harder, the engine straining as they sped down the empty highway. The air was thick with tension, each mile feeling like an eternity. But as they approached the border, Ivan's eyes narrowed. Up ahead, just visible in the fading light, were the flashing red and blue lights of a police checkpoint. "Damn it," Ivan cursed under his breath, slowing the car. He glanced at Martin, who had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Martin whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Ivan didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the area, looking for an escape. To the right, there was a narrow dirt road, barely visible in the growing darkness. Without a second thought, Ivan jerked the wheel, swerving off the highway and onto the rough path. The car bounced and jolted as they tore through the uneven terrain, the checkpoint fading into the distance behind them. Martin clung to the seat, his knuckles white. "Where are we going?" he shouted over the roar of the engine. "Anywhere but there," Ivan replied, his voice grim. He knew they were running out of options. The police were closing in, and their chances of slipping away were growing slimmer by the second. But Ivan wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He had survived too much, fought too hard, to let it end like this. He would find a way out, even if it meant leaving Martin behind. Because in the end, survival was all that mattered. And Ivan had always been a survivor. The dirt road twisted and turned, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in on them as darkness fell. Ivan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the path ahead for obstacles. The headlights cut through the night, bouncing erratically as the car struggled over the rough terrain. Branches scraped against the sides, the sound grating in the otherwise quiet, and Ivan knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Martin shifted restlessly in his seat, the fear in his eyes turning into something close to despair. "They'll find us, Ivan. We can't keep running like this," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Ivan didn't answer right away. He was focused on getting as far away from the main road as possible, putting as much distance between them and the police as he could. It wasn't the first time he'd been in a chase, but never with a man like Martin. A man with no training, no calm under pressure, just sheer panic written all over his face. They needed a plan, and fast. The boathouse had been their last real stop, and now it was all improvisation. Ivan scanned the roadside, looking for any sign of shelter, something they could use to disappear from the prying eyes that would no doubt come looking for them. The terrain was unfamiliar, woods and fields that stretched endlessly, with no sign of civilization. "There's a cabin," Martin said suddenly, pointing ahead. Ivan squinted, and sure enough, just visible through the trees was the outline of an old structure, partially hidden by overgrown brush. He hesitated for a moment, then decided it was worth the risk. He turned the wheel sharply, guiding the car off the path and towards the cabin. The car came to a jarring stop in front of the dilapidated structure. Ivan killed the engine, plunging them into silence save for the sound of their own breathing and the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. He turned to Martin, his expression hard. "Get out. We'll hide here for the night." Martin wasted no time scrambling out of the car, his legs unsteady as he stood. Ivan followed, pausing only to grab a duffel bag from the back seat, the one with whatever cash and supplies he could gather before they'd left the city. He led the way up to the cabin, kicking the door open with little effort. It swung inward with a loud creak, the hinges rusted from years of neglect. The cabin was small, A single room with a broken table in the center and an old iron stove in the corner. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. But it was shelter, and it was hidden, which was all that mattered to Ivan. Martin stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, his head in his hands. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Ivan saw a glimpse of the man beneath the businessman. A man who had lost everything, not just his wealth and power, but also his belief that he could control his own fate. Ivan, Martin began, his voice breaking. What are we doing? Where do we even go from here? Ivan ignored the question at first. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the wood to see if there were any signs of pursuit. The forest was dark, the only light coming from the faint sliver of moon above. They had some time, but not much. They had to decide their next move by morning. After a long silence, Ivan finally spoke. We rest tonight. In the morning, we keep moving. We'll head south, stick to the back roads. He looked at Martin, his expression unreadable. You're going to need to toughen up, Martin. The worst isn't over. Martin laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You think I don't know that? I've lost everything, Ivan. My business, my family. Everything I built, gone. He looked up at Ivan, his eyes filled with something between desperation and anger. And you're still here. Why? Ivan stared at him for a long moment. It was a question he'd been asking himself, too. Why was he still here? Why hadn't he left Martin to face the consequences alone, like so many other clients in the past? Maybe it was loyalty, or maybe it was just the idea that he wasn't ready to face what would happen if he went out on his own. Or maybe, deep down, Ivan saw something of himself in Martin. The drive to succeed, the willingness to take risks. Those traits that had once made Martin a successful businessman weren't so different from what had kept Ivan alive all these years. But now, here they were, reduced to hiding in an abandoned cabin, running from a fate that seemed inevitable. Because I have a job to finish, Ivan said finally, his voice low. And because we're not done yet. Martin looked at him, confusion in his eyes, but he didn't press. He seemed too tired to argue, too drained from the fear and the running. He simply nodded, leaning back against the wall, his eyes closing as exhaustion took over. Ivan remained standing, watching the window, his ears straining for any sound that might signal trouble. He knew they wouldn't be able to run forever. Eventually, the law would catch up, and when that happened, Ivan had to decide where he stood. He had helped Martin for the money, for the lifestyle, but now it was about survival. And the truth was, Ivan had always been a survivor. He had been through worse than this, scraped through situations that seemed impossible. And he intended to do it again with or without Martin. The hours ticked by, the night growing darker and colder. Ivan stayed awake, keeping watch, his mind running through the possibilities of escape. He'd wait for dawn, and then they'd move. And if Martin couldn't keep up, well, Ivan would have to do what needed to be done. The first hint of light began to filter through the cracks in the walls, and Ivan knew it was time. He turned to Martin, shaking him awake. Get up, he said, his voice firm. We need to move. Martin groaned, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. He looked around, disoriented, then remembered where they were. Fear flashed across his face, but he stood, nodding. Okay, he said quietly. Ivan shouldered the duffel bag and moved to the door, peering outside. The woods were still, the morning mist hanging low among the trees. It was quiet. Too quiet, Ivan thought, his instincts telling him something was off. And then he heard it, the crunch of a footstep on gravel. Ivan's blood ran cold. He turned to Martin, his finger to his lips in a gesture for silence. He moved quickly to the window, peering out, and his heart sank. In the distance, through the haze of morning mist, he saw them. Figures moving through the trees, their silhouettes unmistakable. Law enforcement. They had found them. Ivan turned back to Martin, his expression hardening. They're here, he whispered. We have to go. Now. Panic flashed in Martin's eyes, but he nodded, following Ivan as he moved to the back of the cabin. Ivan kicked open a door that led outside, and they slipped out, the cold morning air biting at their skin. They moved quickly, staying low, making their way towards the thicker part of the forest. But Ivan knew they were running out of options. The net was closing in, and he had to decide. Would he keep dragging Martin along, or cut him loose to save himself? As they ran, Ivan glanced at Martin, stumbling beside him, his face pale and drawn. It was then that Ivan made his decision. He grabbed Martin's arm, pulling him to a stop. "What are you doing?" Martin gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "Listen to me," Ivan said, his voice urgent. "You go that way." He pointed towards a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. "Keep moving. Don't stop. I'll draw them away." Martin stared at him, shock and confusion in his eyes. "What? No, you can't." "I can, and I will," Ivan interrupted. "This is your chance, Martin. Don't waste it." For a moment, Martin looked like he was about to argue. But then he nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you, Ivan," he whispered. Ivan gave him a grim smile. "Just go," he said. And with that, Martin turned and ran, disappearing into the forest. Ivan watched him for a moment, then turned, heading in the opposite direction, towards the approaching figures. He moved quickly, making as much noise as possible, drawing their attention away from Martin. Because in the end, Ivan was a survivor, and he would give Martin a fighting chance, even if it meant risking everything. Ivan bolted through the forest, the shouts and heavy footsteps of law enforcement echoing behind him. His breath was ragged, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind was focused, sharp. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to stay ahead, even as his legs felt like they might give out. Suddenly, up ahead, a dark shape emerged through the trees. A cabin, old and decrepit, almost swallowed by the forest around it. Ivan's eyes narrowed as a plan began to form. This was his chance. He needed to change the narrative. He had been running for too long, and it was time to turn the tables. He burst into the cabin, slamming the door behind him. The air was stale, and the floor was covered in debris. Ivan's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, he could use. And then he saw it. A rusted iron poker by the fireplace, likely left by some long-gone occupant. He grabbed it, feeling the cold metal in his hand, and he crouched low, positioning himself near the door. The minutes dragged by, the sound of pursuit drawing closer, until Ivan heard the crunch of footsteps right outside the cabin. He steadied his breath, his muscles tensed, every fiber of his being coiled like a spring. The door creaked open slowly, the silhouette of an officer appearing in the frame. Ivan moved like lightning, swinging the iron poker down, catching the officer across the back of the head. The man crumpled instantly, the flashlight he was holding clattering to the floor. Ivan didn't pause. He grabbed the man's radio, yanking it free from his belt, and turned the volume down, silencing the static. He dragged the unconscious officer out of sight, hiding him behind an overturned table. Ivan knew it wouldn't be long before the others realized something was wrong. He needed to act fast. The officer's gear included a handgun, and Ivan took it, shoving it into the waistband of his jeans. He slipped back out of the cabin, his eyes scanning the forest. The others were nearby, but they hadn't yet noticed that one of their own was missing. Ivan moved carefully, sticking to the shadows, inching his way towards where he saw flashes of movement between the trees. He could hear them talking, coordinating, their voices low but urgent. They were closing in, tightening the net, but they still thought of him as prey, an animal on the run, scared and desperate. They had no idea he had turned into the hunter. Ivan circled around, positioning himself behind one of the officers who had lagged behind the main group. He moved quickly, his hand going over the man's mouth as he pulled him back, the other arm wrapping around his throat, cutting off his air. The struggle was brief, the officer going limp in his arms. Ivan laid him on the ground quietly, taking his radio as well. Now he had two of them. The remaining officers were starting to get nervous. Ivan could see them up ahead, their flashlights crisscrossing as they tried to locate their missing team members. They were calling out now, the tension in their voices palpable. Ivan took one of the radios and, keeping his voice low, whispered into it, "Help! Need help?" North side. Instantly, the flashlights shifted, the officers moving in the direction of the voice. Ivan smirked. It was working. He moved in the opposite direction, slipping away into the forest, putting distance between himself and the confusion he had sown. They were disoriented, scattered, and he was free. But Ivan wasn't done yet. He had one last piece of unfinished business, Martin. He knew Martin would be running for the border, desperate to disappear, to find some way out of this mess. Ivan had given him a head start, but he also knew Martin better than Martin knew himself. He knew the man would panic, that he'd stick to the obvious routes, and Ivan intended to use that predictability to his advantage. By dawn, Ivan reached a narrow backroad, the one that led toward the state line. He hid behind a cluster of bushes, waiting, listening. And then he heard it, the sound of labored footsteps, the crunch of leaves and branches as someone stumbled through the forest, out onto the road. Ivan stepped out from his hiding place, his eyes locking onto the disheveled figure of Martin. Martin froze, his eyes widening in shock and fear as he saw Ivan standing there, the handgun now visible in his hand. "Ivan," he gasped, breathless, his face pale. You said you'd help me?" Ivan took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "I did help you, Martin. I gave you a chance. But you wasted it." Martin shook his head, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape, but there was none. "Please," he stammered. "We can still make it. We can get out of this together." Ivan's face hardened. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice cold. "You're the reason we're in this mess. Your greed, your arrogance. You thought you could buy your way out of anything. But now there's no one left to bribe. No one left to save you." Martin took a step back, his hands raised, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm sorry, Ivan. I'll do anything. Just don't." Ivan didn't wait for him to finish. He raised the gun, the report echoing through the quiet morning as he pulled the trigger. Martin crumpled to the ground, a look of shock frozen on his face. Ivan stood over him for a moment, his expression blank, and then he turned away, disappearing back into the forest. There was no satisfaction in what he had done, no sense of victory. But it was necessary. Martin was a loose end, a liability, and Ivan had learned long ago that in order to survive, you had to be willing to do whatever it took. No sentiment, no hesitation. The forest swallowed him once more, and Ivan moved quickly, heading away from the road, away from the border. He knew the police would catch up eventually, but by the time they did, he would be long gone, a ghost once again. He had no plan, no destination. Just the knowledge that he had survived, that he had outwitted them all, and that as long as he drew breath, he would keep moving, keep fighting. Ivan was a survivor, and in a world where loyalty was a lie and greed destroyed everything it touched, that was all that mattered.